Biker gang surrounds veteran until he makes a call. Joe Collins, a retired war veteran, lives in a modest home on the outskirts of Flagstaff, Arizona. His life is a quiet routine, shaped by the rhythm of a small-town existence and the memories of a past long gone. At 73, Joe finds himself distanced from the chaos of the world, but still in search of the peace and simplicity he found after so many years of military service. He wakes early, greeted by the chirping of birds and the soft morning light streaming through his curtains. With slow, deliberate steps, he prepares for another day. His house, with a view of the mountains, is a reflection of his personality, simple but full of history. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Joe has always had a special relationship with silence and tranquility. His house, modest as it may be, is surrounded by a well-maintained garden where native Arizona flowers and plants bloom, giving him a sense of connection to the land and a feeling of stability. He tends to his garden with the same care and attention he once gave to his military equipment during his service years. For Joe, gardening is more than a hobby. It's a way to keep his hands busy while also reflecting on life. Each fallen leaf and each sprouting bud in Joe's garden is a reminder that life continues, even if in imperceptible ways. He feels at peace, as though through nature, he's reconnecting to something larger, something that transcends the conflict he once experienced in his youth. For years, Joe was a man of action, someone whose life was shaped by the discipline of the military. The years of combat and military service were times when he didn't have to think much, as his mission was clear and the challenges were direct. But with retirement came quietude, and while Joe initially welcomed the break with relief, he soon realized that silence could be both a friend and an enemy. Loneliness, which he had thought would be the perfect cure for the exhaustion of battle, became a weight he didn't know how to carry. While his body was at rest, his mind never stopped racing, constantly reliving moments from the war, from lost friendships, and from comrades with whom he had shared those difficult and dangerous days. In the early years after retirement, Joe threw himself into the everyday activities of a normal life, trying to distance himself from the horrors of the past. He began to involve himself in the local community, becoming a familiar presence in the town of Flagstaff. Mornings were filled with his daily visit to the corner coffee shop, where he sat at a corner table, reading the newspaper while sipping his black coffee. The townspeople recognized him and greeted him with respect, many of them aware of his military background, but few knew of the scars he carried, both physical and emotional. Joe had become part of the small-town scene. He wasn't a man of many words, but he had a silent way of commanding respect. Most people knew he was a veteran, but few knew exactly what that meant for him. Joe never spoke about his experiences in the war. He kept those details locked away, like a secret he was never comfortable sharing. He was proud of his service to the country, but never felt the need to flaunt that part of his life. For him, the years of battle had been just one chapter in his story, not the definition of who he was. Though he carried the weight of the war silently, that part of his life seemed distant, as if it had happened in another time, to another person. However, there was something inside Joe that still longed for a deeper sense of purpose. What made him get up each morning? What kept him active and alert, even when retirement seemed to have taken away the need for a clear purpose? He knew he couldn't spend his days just tending the garden or going to the coffee shop. That wasn't the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Joe felt a need for connection, for being part of something greater again. Retirement, with its peace and routine, had brought comfort, but also a sense of disconnection from the world outside. Sometimes, late at night, when he gazed up at the starry sky, he felt a deep emptiness, a longing for a time when he knew exactly what to do, when he was making a difference in the lives of others. On weekends, Joe met with his fellow veterans. They would gather at his house or at a local bar, reminiscing about past glories and the hardships they had faced during military service. While Joe's friends shared a deep bond, that friendship was also marked by silences. They didn't speak openly about the traumas they had in common, but there was an unspoken understanding. The physical scars were easy to see, but the emotional ones were harder to identify. And while Joe valued these gatherings, something inside him always felt like it wasn't enough to fill the growing emptiness in his life. Joe's friendships were deep, but he often found himself thinking about how those connections were limited. While these meetings gave him a sense of belonging, he knew that the camaraderie of his veteran friends was not the same as the intensity of the bond they had shared during military service. During the war, he and his comrades were united by a single purpose, and that created an almost unbreakable bond. But now, when he met with his friends, he felt that connection was fractured, or at least weakened. Maybe it was age, or the fact that the war was a distant memory. Even so, he often found himself searching for something more. He felt like he was losing something important, something that made him more than just an ordinary man. Joe loved to ride his motorcycle. The bike gave him a sense of freedom he didn't find in anything else. When he was on two wheels, he felt in control, without limitations. The wind rushing past his face and the sensation of constant movement brought him a pleasure no other activity could provide. Each ride was a moment for him to clear his mind and feel the road as an extension of himself. It was the only part of his life that still connected him to the sense of mission and adventure. And yet, while riding through the empty roads of Arizona, a feeling of loneliness persisted. He loved the freedom his motorcycle gave him, but he knew it wasn't enough. He needed something more, something that couldn't be found in the roar of the engine or in the turns around town. Joe's daily routine was meticulously structured, a reflection of his military life, but at the same time, this structure gave him a sense of security. He liked knowing he had control over his day, that nothing was unpredictable. But deep down, Joe knew he was beginning to feel a void, as if something important was missing. He sought something deeper, a more meaningful connection that would pull him out of his repetitive routine. Perhaps it was the desire to experience something more grand, to have a reason to fight again, a mission that would give his life purpose. Perhaps it was the very fear that, with time, he would become irrelevant. On his mind, Joe began to imagine what that something more might be. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he felt that something was about to happen. Something that would, in the end, give new meaning to what he believed was the final phase of his life. And perhaps, without knowing it, fate was about to place him in a situation that would change everything. But for now, he followed his routine, living in the moment, hoping that this emptiness would be filled somehow, even though he didn't know exactly how. Joe Collins had always believed that peace and solitude were the rewards of a life well lived. After years of service in the military, he thought retirement was the moment he could finally relax and enjoy the simple things he had worked so hard to protect. It wasn't just the quiet mornings or the tranquil evenings that he longed for, but also the relief from the constant pressure of conflict and the relentless physical and mental exhaustion that defined his younger years. The stillness of Flagstaff, with its distant mountains and the sweeping desert horizon, seemed like the perfect backdrop for his new life. But now, in the twilight of his years, Joe began to question whether he had truly found peace, or if he had merely settled into complacency. For months, the nagging feeling had been there, just beneath the surface of his otherwise calm demeanor. It wasn't a single event that had caused this unrest, but rather the slow, creeping realization that something was missing from his life. He had been trying to fill this void in different ways, finding solace in his garden and his morning coffee rituals, but those moments of quiet introspection only seemed to highlight the absence of something deeper. Joe had spent so many years living in the structure and order of the military, with clear goals and a sense of purpose in each mission. Now everything seemed too passive, too routine. He had become a man defined by the things he no longer did, rather than by the things he was capable of achieving. The call to action came in the form of a seemingly inconsequential incident at a local gas station. Joe had pulled in for fuel one sunny afternoon, his motorcycle humming quietly beneath him as he filled up. The station was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. It was the type of place where the elderly customers gathered to share gossip, where the young kids in town would stop for snacks, and where the local veterans, like Joe, would occasionally meet for coffee after long rides. That day, as Joe stood at the pump, a group of young men in their late 20s or early 30s pulled in, their loud motorcycles announcing their arrival before they even parked. The group was boisterous, their energy as palpable as the heat of the Arizona sun. Joe barely glanced at them as he finished filling his tank, lost in his own thoughts. He was used to the occasional distraction from the younger crowd, especially the bikers who were frequent visitors in the area. But what caught his attention was the aggressive tone of their conversation. They were laughing loudly, passing a few crude remarks about something they had seen on the road, when one of the men, clearly more intoxicated than the rest, began making pointed jabs at Joe. At first, Joe tried to ignore the comments, focusing on securing the cap of his gas tank and preparing to leave. He had dealt with confrontation countless times in his younger days, and now, in his later years, he preferred to let the young men have their fun. But the situation escalated quickly. The drunk biker made a few snide remarks about Joe's age, asking if he remembered the days when real men fought wars and sarcastically questioning whether he had ever really been in the service. The insults were juvenile, but the implication was clear. Joe's military past, the very thing he held dear, was being mocked. Something inside Joe snapped. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain composed, but the combination of the man's disrespectful tone and the alcohol-fueled bravado began to wear on him. Joe could feel the anger rising within him, the familiar rush of adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. The years of training, of living in an environment where respect was demanded and earned, had taught him to never back down when honor was at stake. And though he was older now, though his body had slowed with time, his mind was still sharp, still accustomed to the idea of defending what mattered. With a calmness that belied the turmoil inside, Joe turned toward the group of bikers. "You got a problem, son?" he asked, his voice steady but firm, the years of military discipline evident in his demeanor. The drunken biker, taken aback for a moment, laughed loudly and made another flippant comment, challenging Joe in front of his friends. He was clearly looking for a fight, eager to test this elderly veteran. Joe, however, wasn't interested in a physical confrontation. He had no desire to prove himself in the same way he had when he was younger. But what bothered him most was not the threat of violence. It was the disrespect. It was the way these young men, who had no real understanding of what Joe had been through, were so quick to degrade him. Just as tensions were reaching a boiling point, Joe did something unexpected. Instead of reacting in anger, instead of escalating the confrontation, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. His hand was steady, his fingers moving with the precision of someone who had dealt with more serious situations before. He wasn't dialing for help, per se, but rather reaching out to the only people who could understand the significance of the moment, his brothers, the local veterans with whom he had shared so many years of his life. "Hey, it's Joe," he said simply into the phone. "I need some backup." There was a pause as the voice on the other end responded, and then Joe hung up. The bikers, still mocking him, were unaware of the fact that Joe had just called in reinforcements, veterans who shared his bond of loyalty and respect. The bikers didn't know what to make of Joe's calm response. In the year since his service, they had come to believe that veterans were relics of a past era, men who had grown old, faded into obscurity. They didn't realize that Joe was far from just another aging man in a small town. Joe's calmness and composure were a silent threat they didn't understand, a reminder that old warriors never really fade, they only wait for the right moment to rise again. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours to Joe. The bikers continued to taunt him, unaware that the situation was quickly spiraling toward an inevitable conclusion. Then, in the distance, the sound of revving engines echoed across the empty road. It was a low rumble at first, but it quickly grew louder as a group of motorcycles appeared over the horizon. Joe's heart settled into a steady rhythm. He knew that his friends, his brothers in arms, were close. They had never let him down before, and they wouldn't start now. One by one, the motorcycles appeared, their riders cutting through the heat of the Arizona air like a blade through soft fabric. As they neared the gas station, the bikers' attitudes shifted. The cocky sneers faltered, the jeers fell silent, and the tension in the air became palpable. Joe's brothers had arrived, veterans just like him, men who had fought in wars both overseas and within their own hearts. They were no longer the young men who had shared the same battles with him, but they were still his comrades, still his brothers. And, together, they were a force to be reckoned with. The sight of these veterans, arriving one after another on their bikes, was enough to silence the group of young men. The older bikers were not just some ragtag group, they were a symbol of strength, resilience, and unity. In that moment, Joe realized that the small-town life he had settled into was not the end of his story. There was still strength in numbers, in brotherhood, and in the bonds forged in the heat of battle. This small, seemingly insignificant moment had stirred something deep within him, a longing for the connection and purpose he had once had. As the bikers turned tail and left, Joe stood silently, watching them disappear into the horizon. He knew that what he wanted was not just respect. He needed purpose, something more than just the quiet life he had built. And for the first time in years, Joe realized that the life he had been living, though peaceful, was no longer enough. He had been waiting for something that would give him back the fire he thought he had lost. And now he understood what he needed: a purpose, a cause, a reason to fight again. The moment the sound of motorcycles reverberated through the dusty air, Joe Collins felt a wave of familiarity wash over him. It wasn't just the roaring engines that stirred something inside him. It was the sound of his past, of the brotherhood that had once defined every waking moment of his life. In his younger years, the buzz of a motorcycle engine had always been a harbinger of something new, a new mission, a new location, a new chapter. But this time, it wasn't the start of a new battle or the end of a mission. It was a confrontation that Joe had never anticipated and a call to action he hadn't expected to answer. As the first bike in the convoy reached the gas station, Joe's heart quickened. The group of veterans wasn't just arriving to intervene. They were coming to remind him of a world he had left behind. These were men he had fought alongside in wars both abroad and at home, men who had seen things Joe never spoke of, and men who had stood by him through some of the most challenging times of his life. Yet, now they weren't just his comrades. They were his way back into the world he had distanced himself from. They were his bridge to something more. As the veterans dismounted, their worn leather jackets and faded military patches marked the transformation of the gas station from a quiet pit stop into something else entirely. The air around Joe crackled with tension and electricity that had been missing in his life for so long. For the first time in years, he felt the stirring of something more visceral than the steady calm he had come to rely on. He had spent so much time in isolation, withdrawing into the safety of his routines and small-town life, but now he was being thrust back into the kind of world where decisions carried weight, where camaraderie meant life or death, and where every action had a consequence. He had spent the better part of the last decade avoiding confrontations like this one. The last time he had been involved in a situation requiring such a response had been years ago, when he and his comrades had been stationed overseas. In those days, the stakes had been high, the outcome of each mission determining not just the fate of those involved, but the safety of their country. Now, though, the stakes were different. This wasn't a war, but it felt like one. The bikers who had been taunting him weren't enemies in the traditional sense. They were symbols of the disconnection he felt from the younger generation, the alienation that had slowly crept into his life since he left the service. For a brief moment, Joe wondered if this was the moment when his life would change forever. There was no script for this encounter, no clear-cut answer to how things would unfold. He hadn't planned to face these bikers, nor had he expected to call upon his brothers in arms. But in this brief, charged moment, Joe realized that he was entering uncharted territory, not just in terms of the immediate confrontation, but in terms of his own life. He was being called to take a stand, not just for his own pride or honor, but for something deeper, for the very essence of what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. As the bikers began to retreat, their bravado faltering in the face of the veteran convoy, Joe's mind raced. The conflict was over, but the seeds of something new had been planted. The situation wasn't merely about a small-town altercation. It had forced Joe to look at his life with a new perspective. His desire for peace, his yearning for quiet moments, had kept him isolated for far too long. Now, Standing amidst the group of men he had once known as family, Joe felt something stirring within him, a realization that perhaps the quiet life he had sought wasn't as fulfilling as he had imagined. Perhaps there was something more he needed. One of the veterans, a tall man named Jack, who had been a close friend of Joe's during their service, clapped him on the back. His rough, weathered hands gripped Joe's shoulders in a gesture of solidarity. "You're not in this alone, Joe," Jack sighed. His voice low but filled with an understanding that spoke volumes. "You never were." Joe nodded, the weight of Jack's words sinking in deeper than he expected. He hadn't realized just how much he had needed to hear those words. In the years since he had left the service, he had convinced himself that he was fine on his own, that his quiet life in Flagstaff was all he needed. But in that moment, surrounded by the men who had once been his comrades, Joe saw the truth he had been avoiding. His isolation, though self-imposed, had been a shield. He had buried his need for connection beneath layers of routine, but the call to action, this unexpected moment, had shaken him to his core. This confrontation with the bikers wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about realizing that he couldn't stand alone anymore. The world had changed, and Joe had changed with it. But what hadn't changed was his need for the brotherhood that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his life. He had thought he could live without it, but now he knew differently. As the veterans prepared to leave, one by one, they exchanged looks of silent understanding. There was no need for words. Joe had entered an unfamiliar situation, but in doing so, he had rediscovered a part of himself he had long forgotten. The bikers had triggered something deep within him, but it wasn't anger or resentment that had surfaced. It was a longing for purpose, a desire for connection, and a realization that he could never truly walk away from the brotherhood that had defined his life. The group of veterans began to file out of the gas station, their engines roaring to life as they prepared to leave. But before they did, Joe turned to Jack, his voice steady but filled with a new sense of determination. "Where do we go from here?" Jack's eyes softened, and he smiled knowingly. "We ride, Joe. We ride wherever the road takes us. And if you need something more than this quiet life, if you're looking for a reason to keep fighting, you know where to find us." Joe nodded slowly, the weight of his decision settling in. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but he knew that it was a road he couldn't travel alone. The quiet life he had created for himself, though peaceful, had left him yearning for more. The time had come for him to face the unknown, not just in the physical world, but in his own heart. As the group of veterans rode off into the distance, Joe stood there for a moment, watching them disappear. The roar of their engines faded into the distance, but the sense of purpose that had filled him remained. Joe had entered an unfamiliar situation, but in doing so, he had learned something crucial about himself. The past was never truly gone. It was always there, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the moment Joe had been waiting for all along. In the days that followed the confrontation with the bikers, Joe Collins found himself wrestling with more than just the memory of the encounter. The incident had been a catalyst, a brief moment of external tension that had, in turn, sparked a whirlwind of internal reflection. It wasn't the act of confronting the bikers that had unsettled him. It was the sudden, unexpected reconnection with the brotherhood of veterans that had so long been absent from his life. For the first time in years, Joe had felt the raw, unfiltered strength of camaraderie, and it had shaken him to his core. At first, Joe had thought he would return to his quiet life, retreating into the safety of his familiar routine. But something had changed within him. There was an unease in the air now, a persistent hum in the back of his mind that refused to dissipate. The veterans had offered him more than just a ride to safety. They had rekindled a flame in him, one that had long since been extinguished by time and isolation. The question was, what would he do with it now? Joe tried to return to his old habits. He resumed his morning walks through the quiet streets of Flagstaff, took his usual seat at the diner, and spent his afternoons tinkering with small repairs on his house. But none of it felt the same. The weight of the past, the memories of the comrades he had lost, of the battles he had fought, seemed to weigh on him more than ever before. The peace he had once sought in solitude now felt like an illusion. It was a fleeting comfort, a temporary escape from a deeper longing he had never fully acknowledged. The veterans, meanwhile, had not left him alone. Jack, the friend who had always been his anchor, called him frequently, each time inviting him to join in one of their rides, or to meet up at the local American Legion Hall for one of their regular gatherings. Joe initially declined, telling himself that he needed time to process what had happened, that he wasn't ready to dive back into that world. But the calls kept coming, each one more persistent than the last. It wasn't long before Joe found himself standing at the threshold of the Legion Hall one afternoon, staring at the faded sign that read, "Veterans of Foreign Wars." The building was small, nothing glamorous, but inside, it was filled with history, old photographs lining the walls, medals displayed in glass cases, and the laughter of men and women who had walked similar paths in life. Joe hesitated before walking in. It felt like crossing an invisible line, stepping from the solitude he had known for so long into the realm of something he had left behind. The moment he entered, he was greeted with familiar faces. Some of them he hadn't seen in years, but all of them knew him. They offered handshakes and hugs, slapping him on the back with the kind of camaraderie that only those who had fought side by side could understand. Joe stood there, feeling like an outsider in his own skin. He had been away from this world for too long, and yet, here it was, waiting for him, as if it had never changed. Jack clapped him on the back, a wide grin on his face. "Told you we'd get you here eventually, Joe. You can't run from us forever." Joe forced a smile, nodding as he took a seat at the bar. It was strange to be back, to hear the banter of veterans swapping stories of their younger days, of the wars they had fought, and the friends they had lost. But there was something else in the air, something that felt like a call to action, a demand for more than just idle talk. It wasn't just about reliving the past, it was about the present and the future. As Joe listened to the conversations around him, he couldn't help but feel like an outsider. He had spent so many years in isolation, cut off from the very brotherhood that was now surrounding him. It was like being on the outside of a circle, yearning to be a part of it again, but not knowing how. He had become too comfortable in his own solitude, too familiar with the quiet that he had chosen to embrace. But the world he had left behind wasn't something you could simply walk away from. It was always waiting for you to return, to face the challenges and responsibilities that came with it. The first ride Joe took with the veterans was a simple one, just a few hours out to a nearby memorial site. But for Joe, it felt like a step into the unknown. He hadn't ridden a motorcycle in years, and the sensation of the wind rushing past him, the engine's roar beneath him, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, alive. The world around him seemed to blur as he focused on the road ahead, the familiar feeling of freedom and camaraderie flooding back into his senses. It was as if the years of isolation had been stripped away, layer by layer, with each mile they traveled. As they rode, Joe found himself recalling memories of his time in the service, the missions they had undertaken, the dangers they had faced, and the men who had become like brothers to him. It was a different time, a different place, but the feelings were the same. The loyalty, the trust, and the bond that had held them all together in the face of adversity. Now, as he rode alongside his brothers once more, Joe realized that the bond hadn't been broken. It had just been dormant, waiting for him to come back to it. Yet, despite the sense of belonging that came with being with the veterans, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that he was still on the periphery. He had been out of the game for too long, had distanced himself from the camaraderie he had once known. It wasn't just about riding motorcycles or attending gatherings. It was about the sense of purpose that had once guided him. He had spent so many years avoiding that purpose, thinking that he could find fulfillment in a quiet, peaceful life. But the truth was, the quiet wasn't enough anymore. He needed something more. Over the course of the next few weeks, Joe slowly adapted to the rhythm of the veteran community once more. He attended more rides, more gatherings, and gradually, he started to find his place again. But with each step he took toward reintegration, he was faced with a deeper truth. The road ahead wasn't as clear as he had hoped. There was no easy return to the way things once were. The world had changed, and so had he. But there was something undeniably compelling about the bonds he was rebuilding, the connections that went beyond shared experiences and spoke to something more profound. One evening, as they sat around a fire after a long ride, Joe found himself talking with Jack about the future. Jack had always been the more outspoken of the two, and as they shared a drink, he turned to Joe with a knowing look. "You know, Joe," Jack said quietly, "it's not about going back to what we had. It's about finding something new, something that makes sense in this stage of life. We don't have to live in the past, but we can't ignore it either. It's about finding a way to move forward together." Joe nodded, feeling the weight of Jack's words settle deep within him. He had been looking for something that could bring back the past, something to fill the empty space he had carried for so long. But what Jack was saying was true. It wasn't about returning to what was lost. It was about forging something new with the people who mattered. Something that could stand the test of time, just as their bond had. As the fire crackled and the stars twinkled overhead, Joe realized that he wasn't alone anymore. The journey ahead was still unclear, but for the first time in years, he was ready to face it. The brotherhood he had once known was still there, waiting for him to take the next step. Joe Collins had never expected that the path back into the fold of his veteran brothers would be this fulfilling. It was supposed to be a simple reconnection, a way to ease the weight of years spent alone, to brush off the dust of isolation and find a sense of purpose once more. And yet, as he sat around a roaring fire one evening, listening to the familiar banter of old friends, feeling the camaraderie that had long been absent from his life, he felt something he hadn't in years: satisfaction. The decision to rejoin the veterans was not a conscious one. It was a gradual shift, a natural progression from the quiet existence he had tried to maintain. After months of hesitant visits to the American Legion Hall, the group's weekly rides, and quiet conversations with Jack, Joe had come to a conclusion. He wanted to be here. This was his place. These men, these brothers, understood him in a way that no one else could. The bonds they shared were unspoken, forged in the crucible of war and life's harshest challenges. That was a type of connection Joe had been craving for too long. For Joe, the return to the brotherhood had been a triumph. It was as if everything he had hoped for in his re-entry had come true. He had found himself surrounded by people who cared for him, who had his back no matter what. Each motorcycle ride, each handshake, each shared drink reminded him of the ties that had once bound him to this group, ties that he had willingly severed when he withdrew into isolation. But now, sitting by the fire and hearing the laughter of his brothers, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of accomplishment. He had returned to something real. The veteran community became a new anchor for Joe. It wasn't just about the motorcycles, the casual rides through the desert, or the weekly meetups at the Legion Hall. It was about feeling needed again. When Jack called him to help with a community project or to stand in solidarity during a difficult moment, Joe didn't hesitate. He was part of something now, and it felt good to have a sense of belonging once more. It was something that had been missing from his life for so long, and the gaping hole it had left was now filled. His days had more meaning. His nights were quieter, but not in the lonely, oppressive way they once were. For the first time in years, Joe wasn't haunted by the ghosts of the past. Instead, he was busy creating new memories, new experiences with his brothers that helped erase the nagging emptiness he had lived with. They were his family now in the truest sense of the word. They had his back, and he had theirs. When they went on their rides, it wasn't just for the thrill of the road. It was a shared experience, something that bound them together in ways that words never could. It wasn't about the distance they traveled. It was about the space they filled in each other's lives. But as Joe began to settle into this newfound sense of purpose, there were moments when a flicker of doubt would surface, but he quickly dismissed it. He had what he needed now, didn't he? He had found the camaraderie that had once sustained him. He had returned to his brothers. What more could he ask for? It was during one of these moments of fleeting doubt that Joe was reminded of a key truth, one he had been trying to suppress. As satisfying as it was to be back with his brothers, there were elements of his life that couldn't be so easily erased. The past didn't simply vanish because he was riding with a group of men who shared similar experiences. The memories of war, of the deep loss and pain that came with it, still lingered. His brothers could not replace the ghosts of the men he had lost, nor could they fill the hollow spaces that had been carved out by years of solitude. It was on one of these evening rides that Joe began to feel the weight of this realization. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert highway, and the air was cool, but not cold. As the group of veterans revved their engines and sped through the quiet roads outside Flagstaff, Joe's mind wandered. The rush of the wind, the power of the engines beneath them, the rhythmic hum of the motorcycles, it all felt so natural, so familiar. But as he looked around at the faces of the men he was riding with, something shifted inside him. He could hear the laughter, the stories, the old jokes, but a nagging voice inside him asked the question he hadn't allowed himself to consider. Is this enough? For a moment, Joe let himself drift back to the quiet of his home. He thought of his empty house, the silence that had reigned there for so long. The road outside may have been filled with the sounds of laughter and the camaraderie of his brothers, but inside, there was still a quiet that hadn't been fully filled. The things he had been avoiding, the painful memories, the unsaid words, still loomed over him like an unseen shadow. No matter how much he tried to numb himself with the sense of belonging he had found, the deeper questions still gnawed at him. Was this the answer? Was this the life he was supposed to lead? Joe's mind drifted back to the biker gang encounter, the catalyst that had begun this journey. That day had been an awakening of sorts, a sign that his life was more than the quiet existence he had carved out for himself. But now, as he rolled down the highway, his brothers beside him, Joe couldn't ignore the discomfort that was beginning to settle inside him. The false victory he thought he had attained was slowly unraveling. He had joined the group, he had found a place in their world, but it wasn't enough to erase the truths he had been running from. By the time they stopped at the end of the ride, Joe was quiet. The others didn't notice, too busy with their own conversations and laughter, but Jack did. He pulled Joe aside, sensing the shift in his demeanor.
You okay, man?
Jack asked, his voice low, a subtle concern in his tone. Joe nodded, but the hollow feeling in his chest told a different story. Yeah, just thinking, he replied. Jack didn't press. He had seen Joe struggle with his place in the world for years. But Joe wasn't sure if he had an answer for himself just yet. It was easy to say everything was fine, easy to ride with the group and laugh with the others. But there was a deeper truth, one that he hadn't been ready to confront. He had been looking for peace, for purpose, and had thought it would come from rejoining his brothers. But peace wasn't something that could be found on the road, in the camaraderie of shared experiences, or in the familiar faces of those who had fought by his side. Peace had to come from within, and Joe wasn't sure if he was ready to face that truth yet. The sense of victory that had once seemed so fulfilling was beginning to feel fragile. What he had wanted, his sense of purpose, his place among the veterans, was not the complete answer. It was only a part of it, and Joe didn't know if he was ready to face what the other part might be. That night, as he lay in bed, the thoughts swirled. He had achieved what he wanted. He had found his brothers again, and yet, in the quiet moments between the noise of the world, Joe realized that the journey ahead was far from over. He hadn't found everything he needed. Not yet. The price of Joe's return to his veteran brothers had been something he hadn't fully anticipated. At first, it had all seemed so simple. He had rejoined his comrades, stepped back into the fold of the group he had once been so closely bound to. He had filled the emptiness that had plagued him for so long. The laughter, the companionship, the sense of belonging. Everything had felt like a long-lost piece of himself finally falling back into place. But as time wore on, the cracks in the illusion began to show. The first cracks were small, easily dismissed. Moments when the light-hearted banter of his brothers felt a little too loud, when their laughter seemed a little too hollow. The first time Joe tried to ignore the creeping unease in his stomach, thinking it was just exhaustion, or maybe a bit of stress. But the feelings didn't go away. In fact, they intensified. It was during a late-night ride through the desert that the realization hit him. They had just passed the old Route 66 diner, the headlights of the motorcycles casting long shadows on the road ahead. The group of veterans was riding in formation, as they always did, but Joe wasn't focusing on the ride. Instead, He was lost in thought, his eyes scanning the horizon as the wind whipped around him. In that moment, something inside him broke. He realized that he had been using this sense of camaraderie to avoid confronting the deep well of emotions he had buried. The brotherhood, the rides, the shared stories, all of it had been a distraction, a way for him to avoid the pain that still simmered just below the surface. He had hoped that re-entering the group would bring him the peace he so desperately craved, but peace wasn't something that could be found in the noise of constant company or the thrill of high-speed rides. Joe's thoughts wandered back to the faces of the men he had once served with, the faces of those who had died in the war. He had tried to bury those memories, lock them away where they wouldn't haunt him. But here, riding with his brothers again, they were impossible to escape. His friends, men he had laughed and fought with, had died, and Joe had been left behind. He had never allowed himself to grieve, never given himself the chance to mourn the losses that had shaped him. Instead, he had buried it all, choosing to distract himself with the camaraderie of his fellow veterans. He thought that by surrounding himself with them, he could somehow fill the void, but he hadn't realized how deep that void truly was. As the ride continued, Joe found himself growing distant from the others. The familiar faces around him began to feel more like strangers, their voices growing faint in his ears. The laughter that once brought him comfort now felt like an unbearable noise. The group of veterans he had once seen as his family now felt like a crowd, one he was trapped in, unable to escape from. The external connection he had sought had done little to ease the internal pain that still gnawed at him. For the first time since he had rejoined his brothers, Joe understood the cost of what he had done. The price of reconnecting with the group wasn't just the discomfort he felt in the presence of his brothers. It was the sacrifice of his own peace. In his pursuit of camaraderie, Joe had overlooked the importance of finding balance within himself. The brotherhood was a temporary solution, not a lasting cure for the wounds he had been carrying for so long. As they pulled over at a gas station to take a break, Joe lingered behind, stepping away from the group. The familiar faces and the laughter faded as he moved to the back of the lot, where the desert stretched out before him, empty and vast. The cool evening air brushed against his face, but it didn't offer the comfort it once had. Instead, it felt like the wind itself was mocking him, whispering the truth he had been avoiding. Joe sat on the hood of his bike, his eyes fixed on the horizon, and he let the silence wash over him. It wasn't a peaceful silence, though. It was heavy, laden with the weight of everything he had ignored for so long. In his pursuit of belonging, he had allowed himself to remain disconnected from the one thing that could have helped him find peace, himself. For so long, Joe had been convinced that rejoining his brothers would fix everything. He had believed that the sense of purpose and camaraderie he once had would be enough to fill the gaps that had been left in his soul. But as he sat there, staring into the vast expanse of the desert, he realized that what he had found wasn't enough. It was a temporary salve, nothing more. The sense of comfort he had experienced with his brothers was fleeting. It was a false victory. The sound of engines revving interrupted his thoughts, and Joe looked up to see the rest of the group approaching, pulling into the lot where he sat. Jack was the first to approach him, his helmet in hand, his face etched with concern. "You okay, Joe?" Jack asked, his voice low, understanding. Joe nodded slowly, though the lie stuck in his throat. He wasn't okay. Not really. But how could he explain it? How could he tell Jack that the very thing he thought would save him, this brotherhood, this community, wasn't the solution he had hoped for? That it had come at the cost of something deeper, something more personal? "I'm fine," Joe replied, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. Jack didn't press any further, but Joe knew the truth couldn't be hidden forever. Eventually, Jack would realize that Joe was struggling with something more than just the challenges of reintegrating into the group. It was a struggle within himself, an internal battle that Joe wasn't sure how to fight. As they rode back toward Flagstaff, Joe's mind continued to race. The laughter of his brothers filled the air once more, but it was a distant noise. It was as if he were trapped inside a bubble, separated from the world around him. The road stretched out before him, but it felt like an endless journey, one that had no clear destination, No clear answer. The price Joe had paid for his re-entry into the Brotherhood wasn't just the discomfort he felt in the presence of his friends. It was the loss of something more profound. In his search for fulfillment, he had neglected the work that needed to be done within himself. The external connections he had sought couldn't replace the internal peace he had been missing for so long. That night, as Joe lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he realized that he had reached a crossroads. The path he had been following, the one that had led him back to his brothers, wasn't the right one. It wasn't the answer he had been hoping for. And as much as he wanted to believe that the Brotherhood could heal him, he knew now that the real work had to come from within. It wasn't enough to lean on his brothers for comfort. He needed to confront his own pain, his own losses, and find the strength to heal from within. The price of what he had wanted, the camaraderie, the purpose, the sense of belonging, had been steep. It had cost him the chance to find true peace. But now, Joe was faced with a new realization. In order to truly heal, he would need to look inward, to confront the darkness he had been avoiding for so long. Only then would he find the peace he had been searching for all along. Joe's return to his familiar life wasn't as dramatic as the rides, the long nights with his brothers, or the struggles of confronting his own inner turmoil. It was quieter, less cinematic, but in its own way, it was a profound shift. He had gone through an intense transformation in his journey over the past few weeks, and now, as he stood outside his modest home in Flagstaff, he found himself viewing the world around him through different eyes. The desert landscape stretched before him, the sun setting in the distance, casting long shadows over the dry earth. It was a familiar view, one that had been with him through many phases of his life. But today it felt different. The harsh, unforgiving terrain that once seemed oppressive now felt like a vast expanse of possibility. The long, empty roads that he had ridden along for years now seemed to hold answers that he had been searching for all this time. Joe had spent the past few weeks mulling over the lessons he had learned, some the hard way, some in quiet moments of self-reflection. He had returned to his home after that night in the desert, after his confrontation with the realization that the things he had sought, his brothers, the camaraderie, the thrill of the ride, were not enough to fill the void inside him. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long wasn't something that could be fixed with external solutions. The peace he had been hoping for didn't come from others, but from within himself. In the weeks that followed, Joe spent more time alone than he had in years. The rides with his brothers had tapered off, and he had stopped attending the regular gatherings. It wasn't that he no longer cared about his brothers or the bonds they shared. It was that he had finally recognized that he needed to heal on his own. The road to healing was not about finding solace in others, but about confronting the pain and the loss that he had buried for so long. He had begun to address the darkness within him, the trauma, the guilt, the grief that he had carried silently since his time in the military. The pain of losing his brothers in arms, the men who had shared the same dangers, the same battles. He had never given himself permission to mourn them. But now, as he sat in the stillness of his home, he realized that he had to face that pain head-on if he ever hoped to find peace. Joe's transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow and steady process, one that required him to let go of the masks he had worn for so long. It was tempting to hold onto the image of the tough, battle-hardened veteran, the man who didn't show weakness, who kept his emotions buried deep inside. But in the quiet solitude of his home, Joe allowed himself to be vulnerable. He allowed himself to grieve. And in that vulnerability, he found a strength that he had never known existed. One evening, as Joe sat on his porch, sipping coffee and watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple, he realized something. He had spent so much of his life looking for a way to fill the emptiness inside him, whether through the camaraderie of his brothers or the thrill of the open road. But now he understood that the emptiness was not something to be filled by external forces. It was something that needed to be understood, acknowledged, and healed from within. The next morning, Joe did something he had never done before. He drove to the local VA clinic, a place he had avoided for years. It wasn't that he was ashamed of seeking help. Rather, he had always believed that he could handle his problems on his own, that reaching out for support was a sign of weakness. But as he stepped through the clinic doors, he realized that seeking help was not a weakness, it was a strength. It was a sign of someone who understood that healing required more than just self-reliance. It required support, understanding, and community. At the clinic, Joe met with a counselor who specialized in veterans' mental health. At first, he struggled to articulate the deep, unspoken pain that had been building inside him for so long. But the counselor was patient, asking gentle questions that helped Joe open up. The sessions were difficult at first. Joe had to confront memories he had buried for years, but slowly, the weight on his chest began to lift. He found himself sharing stories of his brothers, the men he had fought beside, and the deep sense of loss he had carried with him. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And in that process, Joe realized that it wasn't just about healing from the trauma of war. It was about healing from the trauma of years of emotional neglect and self-denial. Through these sessions, Joe began to understand that healing was not a linear process. There were good days, and there were bad days. Some days, he would feel lighter, as if the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. Other days, he would feel the familiar ache of grief and loss. But Joe now understood that these feelings were part of the healing journey. He didn't need to rush through them. He didn't need to push them aside. He just needed to let them exist, acknowledge them, and move through them at his own pace. As the weeks passed, Joe found new ways to connect with himself. He took long walks in the desert, allowing the stillness to soothe his mind. He began writing in a journal, something he had never done before. The pages became a place where he could pour out his thoughts and feelings, a safe space where he didn't have to hide his vulnerability. Through writing, he was able to process his emotions, to make sense of the chaos that had once overwhelmed him. Joe's relationship with his veteran brothers began to shift, too. He no longer sought them out for validation or comfort. Instead, he approached them as equals, people who shared a common bond, yes, but who also respected his journey toward healing. He didn't need their approval anymore. He had learned to value his own voice, his own experiences, and his own healing process. And in that respect, he had gained something far more powerful than the camaraderie he had once sought. He had gained self-respect. The most significant change, however, was within himself. Joe's return to his familiar situation, his home, his life, was not a return to the same person he had been. He was different now, more grounded, more self-aware, and more at peace with the parts of himself he had once denied. He understood that the healing process wasn't about finding the perfect solution or the right answer. It was about learning to live with the imperfections, the scars, and the wounds that made him who he was. As Joe stood on his porch, watching the sunset, he knew that his journey wasn't over. There would still be hard days, moments of doubt, and struggles ahead. But he also knew that he had the tools now to face those challenges, to confront the darkness within, and to continue healing. His path might not be straight, but it was his own. And that, in itself, was enough. The peace he had once sought in the external world had finally come from within. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that true healing doesn't come from the people around you or the things you do. It comes from within yourself. And in that quiet, solitary moment, Joe felt a peace that had eluded him for years. He was finally home, not just in his physical house, but within himself.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.